Here is Dr. Craig Browdy from Zeigler Brothers. Tom couldn't make it, so he's not here to talk with you today, Craig. But I think after this we'll do the raffle. I've got some stuff to get rid of, and we'll spice it up a little bit with a little raffle, and then we'll have more discussions. So thank you, Dr. Browdy, for all your support in putting this workshop together and for your presentation today as well.
Thanks, and thanks for those of you who hung around till the bitter end, the anchor man with the last presentation of the day. But I think, at least in our opinion, perhaps one of the most important topics of the day, which is optimizing feed and feeding programs. And not just optimizing in order to produce shrimp, because a lot of us think that our goal is to produce shrimp. But in fact, as Tom Zeigler would stand up here on top of the table and shout out to y'all, your goal is not to produce shrimp. Your goal is to produce profits. Profits are the bottom line here, and I think we need to keep that in mind whether we're doing research or whether we're starting up a farm or whether we're seasoned producers. Because actually it's the profits are just like air to breathe. If you're not making profits, you're going to be dead. And when you're talking about something that's a really risky proposition like growing shrimp, profits are the risk premium you need when you're putting in capital today in order to get your returns from tomorrow, especially with any kind of agricultural venture. So I think it's clear that we have to focus on the bottom line. So what is the key? What is the key to producing profits? What is the key to success? Well, in our opinion, one of the most fundamental keys to successful and profitable shrimp culture are the feeds you use, and as importantly or more importantly, the management of those feeds. Feeds drive the system. We've heard that several times over the last day and a half, but I want to really emphasize it one more time. Your feed going into the system, only a small percentage is going to come out harvested within the culture species. You're going to be losing feed immediately by not being eaten by the shrimp. That's one of the reasons for continuous feeding, in particular if you feed only a couple times a day. More and more feed is not going to be eaten. Some of it gets eaten by the shrimp but then comes out as feces, or it's eaten and absorbed across the intestine but then metabolites are excreted across the gills. So the question is, how much of the actual feed, carbon and nitrogen that's going into the system is coming out in the cultured species? This Claude Boyd put this together in 2009. This is nothing new. All of this uneaten feed and feces and all this excreted metabolites are going to end up in the water column in this sort of microbial decomposition loop. And as long as you're oxygenated, it's going to be happening aerobically. If it goes to the bottom, if you have areas where feed and organic material collect on the bottom of your production system, then it's going to decompose anaerobically, going to produce hydrogen sulfide, and that, to me, in these kind of systems, is the kiss of death. No collection of any anaerobic material anywhere in your system, period. But what happens when you have too much of this microbial decomposition and things go awry? That's when you start to have health problems. The health problems are directly related to the amount of organic material that's not being used up within the system and how you manage that organic material. So the key to success, one of the keys to success in this whole business, whether you're using clear water systems or whether you're using biofloc systems, is to maximize the nitrogen assimilation of what's coming into the feed into what's going into the shrimp. And if you're doing a good job, you might be getting 30, 40, maybe even % of the nitrogen in the feed going into the shrimp. The rest of the 70% is going into the system and into the water. Do your calculation, do your balance. It's not that complicated. You can figure out how efficient your system is. The question you need to ask yourself is, how do you make this as efficient as possible so that you have less chance of the problems of Vibrio growing up in the water and disease occurring in the system? And again, I've had the opportunity over the last 4 years to sit with Tom in his office, smoke cigars and drink whiskey and talk about shrimp. And he came up with some things that just make sense. They just make sense. A precision feeding concept is to provide each animal with the exact quantity of feed that it can consume when the animal is ready to consume it, with the exact nutrition that the animal requires, with the correct feed particle size, optimum particle texture, in the location where the animal is located. This is the objective to optimize the desired results. Sounds simple, right? It's actually really not so simple. The hard part is that there's a lot of things that go into a proper and efficient feeding program in order to make this happen. But at least we start with the end in mind, as Tom likes to say. Start with the goal in mind, and then see how we get there. Zeigler has been showing this three-legged stool for about 20 years, so if you've seen it before, I apologize. The feeding is basically based on 3 different legs, each of which is important and without which we won't be able to succeed. One is the formulation of the feed, the nutrients that are going into the feed. The second is the pellets themselves, the manufacturing of the feed. And the third, which people often don't talk about and is just as important, are the feeding methods that are used to feed the feed. If any one of the 3 is missing or messed up, the system fails. So let's talk about each one of these in turn. Diet formulation. The diet has to be formulated and specialized according to the life stage of the animals. Typically, the feeds that we use for the younger shrimp are higher in protein, have different nutrient balances than the shrimp that's used for grow-out. All the required nutrients have to be in there in the right quantities with a dense balance of essential nutrients. Our focus, especially for these systems, is to produce a highly palatable and very digestible feed. All feeds for shrimp have to be void of toxins and anti-nutritionals to the degree possible, and they have to support the health of the animal, additives to achieve balance of the immune system and managing stress. So what we want to do is to maximize nitrogen conversion, maximize growth, and decrease water quality problems with the formulation of our feed. We produce feeds at different cost levels in different formulations. If the feed costs less, it's not because we're making less money on it. It's because it has different ingredients and different additives. Our Cadillac feed, our highest cost feed, has the highest quantity of these additives, is very palatable and digestible, minimizes the amount of animal proteins, maximizes the amount of marine proteins, and that's why it's more expensive. Any feed mill has this conflict going on, particularly today. We have limited nutrient supply and raw materials. We only have a certain number of raw materials coming from marine organisms that we can use, and they're high priced and they have variable quality. But at the same time, we're breeding our animals and we're getting them to grow faster and faster, which means we have higher and higher nutrient requirements. The faster growth, better farming, higher yield expectations, particularly with some of these highly engineered clear water systems. This demands a better understanding from the feed mills of nutrient requirements of the animal, of the digestible nutrients that are available in the ingredients, and the opportunities for nutrient supplementation if something is short or something is missing. So it's a very complicated science to produce the best diets that are out there. And the only way to succeed is to have the right tools to be able to do the formulation that you need. Better assessment of ingredient digestibility, palatability, and nutrient utilization. You need to be able to do testing. A lot of people have asked me, 2 people I think so far, about insect meals or other alternative proteins. Yes, very exciting opportunities, but we need to assess how they work, how digestible they are, how palatable they are, how you can use the nutrients. You have to have experimental systems for demonstrating species-specific requirements. You have to be able to test different life stages, and you have to do it in highly replicated systems. We have to have faster assessment of raw material quality and nutrient composition. We have laboratories where we run NIR and other testing to understand our nutrients. Approved understanding of I guarantee you that if there's a new opportunity out there, that we have it on our radar screen and we're testing it, and we're going to be one of the first companies to get it into our feed. Because as a small feed mill on an international scale, we need to be at the tip of the spear on innovation. We also need to measure the effect of the feed on the immune system of the animal, the integrity of the gut, how it digests it, and the overall health status. We've built a research and development laboratory on the campus of Harbor Branch University in Florida. It's run by Peter Van Wyk. You've seen his name on some of the references on the slides. He's been working in this field for a really long time and doing a lot of work on closed systems since the 1980s, I think. It's located here in Florida in the Aquaculture Park. We took over a laboratory in one of these buildings, and we built a system, small-scale system for testing larval feeds. We have a cup system where we can test with individual shrimp and individual cups looking exactly at their nutrient utilizations. And we have a highly replicated aquarium system. We can stock animals into this aquarium system of 150 aquaria at about 2.5 grams of size. And we can pull out animals at 17, 18 grams after 6 weeks. We've gotten as high as 2.7 grams a week with some of our controlled diets in these aquaria, about 5 shrimp per aquarium. We've been involved in a long time in developing things on nutritional immunology. This is an example of a white spot challenge done about 10 years ago with our Vpak, which is our additive that we put in the premium feeds for nutrient balance. And you can see here that it's not just a question of, well, we found something that works, put in as much as possible. If you don't use it at all, we had about 80% mortality. If you use it at a low dosage rate, we had about 50% mortality. If you use it at a high dosage rate, we ended up with 32% mortality, and it's at the medium dosage where we ended up getting, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at it the wrong way. This is survival rate. I usually look at mortality rate. So this is the control, I'm sorry. 20%, 22% survival. This is the low dose at, and it ended up also with 35% survival. The medium dose gave us the highest at 70, and if you go too high, you're overtaxing the immune system, and then when you hit them with the virus, you end up with lower survival. So there's a lot that goes into determining the immunobalance of the animal. Another second leg of the stool and key importance is the physical characteristics of the feed. Things like particle size, particle uniformity, freshness, packaging, how you manage your feeds, how you control them, where you store them. All these things are extremely important to maximizing your production. We have to have feed that's water stable enough to retain nutrients, but not so hard that the shrimp can't eat it. We have to have a shape and texture preferred by shrimp, and of course, proper storage. This is our feed mill in East Berlin, Pennsylvania. This is Tom's slide. I just wanted to put in a little bit of what you would have gotten if he'd have been here. We become what we eat. We can either be very, very strong and healthy, we can be sick, or we can be dead. And a lot of how you end up with, at the end of the day, depends on how you treat your babies, how you treat your nursery shrimp. When I hear the idea of using artificial sea salts for acclimating post-larvae for a couple of days, I'm like cringing. I mean, why not just spend a few extra dollars and use the best salt you can to get them as strong as possible before you put them into that pond? Because what happens to the very young animals is really, in the long run, going to determine what happens in the end. This is some of the stuff that Sachi was talking about, and I apologize for saying it again, but shrimp are not uniform in size. You're going to get a pretty big size variability, particularly depending on where you get your seed stock from. It is very important that you have the right size particle for the shrimp to eat. And one of the things that Sachi showed that's very interesting, if your shrimp are not uniform in size, why would you want to feed a feed where all the feeds are exactly the same particle size? If you use a feed that's more of a balance between different particle sizes, although typically a pretty tight curve, you can actually have particles for all of the animals. And as Sachi said, if you feed your animals with the correct ratios of particle sizes as they grow, you can actually tighten up that curve. As Sachi showed the data, going down from, what was it, about 60% CV to about 30% up to about 6 grams in weight. But you can have the greatest diet in the world with the greatest ingredients, spend as much money as you want on it, but the key is you cannot drive a Ferrari on a dirt road. If you don't have the system and the management, as some people were talking about earlier, to handle these feeds, you have to improve your feeding techniques as you improve the feed technologies. If you're not feeding correctly, do not spend your money on the most expensive feeds because it's going to fail anyway. Overfeeding is a very common mistake with serious consequences. It increases the flock and the bacterial populations in the system, creates more sludge, increases requirements for probiotics. If you're putting in probiotics, you have to add more. Increases your oxygen demand, all these terrible, CO2 production problems, increases ammonia and nitrite, and of course the sludge and hydrogen sulfide, and you end up with outbreaks of disease. Feeding, in our opinion, it should not be based on a feeding table. Feeding should be based on gains and expected feed conversion ratio. The way we calculate feeding rates is to develop a typical growth curve for the growing conditions and the genetic stock that you have. Calculate the daily weight gain that you expect in the shrimp, depending on the age and the size. And as Sachi said, this is, once you get to 3 or 4 grams in size, this is basically linear all the way to harvest. So it'll be the exact same daily weight gain expected. You multiply that gain by the population estimate. Easier said than done, but you need to know how many shrimp are in your tank. And that expected feed conversion ratio, and that gives you the amount of feed that you feed. It's amazing, it sounds so simple and so straightforward, how few people, even in some of the major shrimp producing areas in the world, actually do this successfully. One of the keys is, what feed conversion ratio do you use and how low do you go? We've been learning some really interesting things from some studies that Alan Davis has been done. And as Sachi said, with these microphones that they have now, and how low you can go on feed conversion ratio and still maximize growth. I mean, you can get down very close to a feed conversion ratio of 1 to 1. So what we've done is to develop a precision feeding program. This feeding program is based on growth curves that have to do with the history. First of all, it has to do with the fundamental growth of shrimp, the fundamental growth curve of a typical shrimp. And then you can generate your own curves based on the system's history, the system that you're working on, and the genetics of the animals that you're using. The feeding is based on the population projections, gains per day, FCR, and importantly, temperature. Now we're talking about indoor systems, so temperature should be fairly stable. But in these outdoor ponds and other systems, you must adjust the feeding you're doing according to temperature. And this feeding program also adjusts according to that. It includes a mechanism to adjust the feed rate on the basis of the average weight samples. So during the course of the cycle, you can adjust the feeding rate as necessary. It also has to do with the projected growth per day and, as I said, the temperature. So this is what it looks like. And we have with us here USB sticks with the program on it. Anyone who is using our feeds is welcome to try it out and can have a copy of this if you just see Cheryl at some point. Basically, you put in the information here on the size of your system, the stocking density, the genetics of the animals, and that's determined by how long what size they'll be, how long it takes you to get to 1 gram in size, how many days it takes you to get to 1 gram, and then in the linear part of the growth curve, how many grams per week you expect of the shrimp stock that you're using. You punch those things in, and how many days your cycle is, what your expected survival is, and so on and so forth, and it generates exactly a growth curve, generating the amount of feed you're going to use and every size feed that you're going to need. And when you have to switch feeds, notice that they overlap so that you get the right sizes when the animals are in the right size range. And it gives you up top exactly what you need for the whole crop. Generates, actually, if you have several tanks, you put one of these sheets for each tank, and it automatically generates feeding rates for every tank, for every day, weekly feed needs for the whole system, etc. And again, this is free of charge for anybody who's using our feeds. And I'd be happy to work with people on Skype to show you, how to use it and how to get set up on it. But this is not a feeding table, okay? That's only the first step, is to generate your feeding tables. You need to manage. And it's one of the problems we have with a lot of people who start this up, don't have this sort of experience of working with shrimp, don't have the knowledge of how shrimp work and how it's working and what you actually have in your system. The key to making this thing work is that you have to adjust your feeding rates according to what's happening in your system. That can be done by the manager of the system every day just by changing a number here. which will allow you to adjust your feeding rates according to what's happening in the system. So this is a dynamic program, not a feeding table. It's a feeding program. And the key is to understand and observe your system well enough to see if there's feed left over, you need to decrease. If you see that the animals are dying, you have to reduce your population numbers. If you're weighing and they're not growing as fast as they should be, you have to adjust the size, which you can do here. And in an outdoor system or a greenhouse system, you have to put in your expected temperature for the next week, which will adjust the feeding rate based on the temperature. So managing feed costs is important. Feed cost per unit gain is the FCR times the feed cost, and we saw that in Sachi's. But as I said earlier, the key is the profit, the total expenses minus the total revenues. Now in aquaculture, there's a close relationship between cost inputs and output revenues. And feed plays a critical role in but the problem is that feed plays a really critical role in determining the growth potential, water quality, and health. So if you reduce your cost inputs, you can have a really strong effect on your output revenues. If you invest in your cost inputs, then you can have a strong effect on your output revenues. Take seed stock, for example. If you buy a lousy seed stock because you want to save a few bucks, you're going to destroy your output revenues for the whole crop. So talking about the value of quality feed, you're going to get larger animals, which gives you more value per pound. Healthier animals, once the problems start, they tend to snowball. You're going to get better water quality, less cost for things like probiotics, etc., and faster growth, which means more cycles, less operating cost, and lower risk. And the effect of this on the overall profitability of the system cannot be overestimated, but you must control and manage the feed correctly. And when you're using these feeds in these closed systems, it's really important that the feeds are designed and the feeding program is used to efficiently meet the shrimp requirements. This is extremely important. We have high protein, nutrient-dense formulations and tight control of feeding rates. Supplemental carbon only until the nitrifying community is established. Dilution or denitrification to control the nitrate buildup. Avoid waste buildup over time, phosphorus, minerals, etc., by not exchanging enough water. So here's an example that Sachi showed earlier, and I just want to show with just a tad more detail of a study that he and Tom did with different kinds of input back in 2013. We used two different Zeigler feeds, both of them 35% protein, 7% fat. So remember, just looking at the protein level of the feed is not going to tell you about the quality of the feed. One of them was, it was run in 67 days in 3 40-meter cubed raceways, stocked at 500 per meter, 2.66 grams initial weight in Sachi's system in Corpus Christi at the time. The rations were determined using the FCR of 1.4 and a growth of 1.5 grams per week and assumed mortality of 0.5. But Sachi adjusted the feeding twice a week according to growth samples of the animals. And if you look at actually how much he fed, this was just the beginning, but it was managed and controlled over the course of the cycle. So one of the feeds we call high 35, which is our rocket fuel feed that we use in these systems typically. And the other is an SI 35, which stands for semi-intensive, which is typically used for more like pond systems stocked at lower densities. And we tried them both in Sachi's system, and lo and behold, we got pretty good growth with both of these systems, close to the target line you see here in red, but a little bit better growth with the HI 35 than we got with the SI 35. They went in 67 days, Sachi got the animals to 23 grams. Let's take a look at the results. This is what he showed just a few minutes ago. These were 22, this was 19. The growth was very nice here, 2 grams a week, 1.76. Higher total biomass, higher yield, 8 or 9 kilos per meter. Very good FCR. Note that the FCR here was controlled very carefully by looking at excess feed and so forth. And even though it was targeted at 1.4, he ended up at 1.25. And the survival rates were good. So it really gives you a chance to see what happens with different feeds. So let's look at the at the water quality, first of all. As I told you, feed drives the system. And Tsachi talked about the number of days that the bead filter was running and the foam fractionator. He had to crop solids a lot more out of the SI35 feed, you see it here with the higher TSS, than out of the HI35 feed. So that means that a lot more of this nitrogen in the feed and the carbon was going into the shrimp, and less of it was going into the system and having to be cropped out. You can see the amount of alkalinity that was added was the actual alkalinity level of the water was lower, but we have another graph of the amount that was added of bicarbonate was much higher for the lower quality diet. So all these things are adding inputs to your system. And when you have higher total suspended solids, higher volatile suspended solids, you have more Vibrios, more chance of problems within your system. But let's look at the economic analysis. Now, here, this was done by Terry Hansen at Auburn. All this is basically published. Sales price of $3.27 a pound. Look at the difference in cost of the feed. The semi-intensive feed is 99 cents a kilo, and this is $1.75. It's a huge difference, right? It's tough to make yourself make these kinds of decisions of which feed you're going to buy and to put this much money into it. Some people I've been trying to convince for years and they still won't use, including some of the speakers we've talked to today, although others do use the hyper-intensive. The juvenile production cost he put in, the interest rate, initial investment in the farm, the greenhouse system for this hypothetical example had 8 500-meter raceways. So you can see here, this is the total sales of shrimp per year based on the results of that particular trial. If you look at the feed cost or the fixed cost, they were much higher for the feed cost was much higher for the HI35. The gross receipts were about the same because the same price per pound. But if you look at the net present value after or the 10-year internal rate of return, you can see that you have much higher profits, a much shorter payback time, and higher returns above costs. So the total of the expenses and then the higher returns above the costs for the higher cost diet. This is a sensitivity analysis that Terry did several years ago. And what we did was to take the model and just make a change in a 20% change in different variable costs. So what happens if you charge 20% more for PLs? Well, if your PL costs 20% more, then your change in net present value is going to be 9%. You're going to have 9% lower net present value. Or if you reduce the cost, you'll have 9% higher, right? So if you want to make 9% more money, then buy a cheaper PL. The nursery survival, 10% difference. If you increase the cost of the feed by 20%, or decrease the cost of the feed by 20%, you're going to save 22% in net present value after 10 years. But look at the effect of some of these other things. Look at the effect of shrimp price. 89% increase in net present value if you have a 20% higher shrimp price. So sell your shrimp for a higher price for sure. But look at stocking density is another really important one. 57% with a 20% higher stocking density. More shrimp, you make more money, assuming everything else stays the same. Growth rate, these are the ones that really have a strong effect, are the positive ones, the growth rate, the stocking density, and the grow-out survival. If you increase your survival by 20%, you actually increase your net present value in 10 years by 97%. So, bottom line, if you really want to achieve shrimp production efficiencies and profitability, number one, pay attention to the babies. Feed the early stages properly. It's critical to the overall success. Maintain high performance standards. Make sure that you set your system standards based on the correct metrics and comparing against global standards so that you know where you stand. Feed drives the system. Apply precision feeding. And do not compromise performance to cut cost. Feed is an investment, and as the seed is an investment in overall profitability of the system. Thanks for your attention.